Okay, so I'll just call us back together. So just as an introduction, as we all know, it's a very deeply unsettling time right now. On Friday, November 17th, last week, scientists reported the Earth's average surface temperature momentarily rose above 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels for the first time since humans began keeping records, marking a brief entry into a deadly phase of climate change that scientists have been frantically warning us about for decades. In the face of this ever-expanding crisis, Canadians need our public broadcaster, and indeed all broadcasters, to tell us straight, to inform us of its causes, its impacts, and how it can be addressed. We believe that our national broadcaster has a unique responsibility and ability to cover this unfolding crisis. With a mission to serve communities across Canada through TV, radio, and digital, the CBC is uniquely positioned to play a special role as our climate emergency broadcaster. And the CBC, to its credit, takes this responsibility seriously. In 2021, the CBC News editor-in-chief, Brodie Fentlin, committed to doing more climate change journalism. Climate is now a leading category in the CBC News site, and we've seen laudable programming and content such as What on Earth with Laura Lynch on CBC Radio, Planet Wonder on CBC Gem, the new Climate Dashboard, which allows you to track climate trends across the country historically and in real time, and other great reporting and investigations by many CBC journalists. But the researchers and the campaigners behind this report knew anecdotally that the CBC coverage was lacking in some important ways. Most notably, the lack of stories and accountability directed toward the fossil fuel industry, both its role in causing climate change, its current posture towards increasing oil and gas production in the face of a climate emergency, and the decades-long disinformation campaign to obfuscate and delay policy progress on addressing climate issues. This is perhaps the most widespread crime against humanity we have ever witnessed, one that will result in untold suffering and have implications for generations. Yet scrutiny of the fossil fuel companies is rare, and they are sparsely covered by investigative reports by our national broadcasters. The second thing that became very clear was the need for a daily climate report. In the same way that we have a business report that is broadcast multiple times a day, we need a climate report that brings news from the front lines of the climate crisis, honestly informing Canadians and inspiring them to take action on a daily basis. We saw broadcasters do this during COVID, and we know they are capable of a pivot like this. We wanted to test our anecdotal conclusions, so we partnered with the Climate Emergency Unit to gather data from across the country on CBC's climate reporting. And I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Doug Hamilton-Evans, in a moment to present our report. But before I do, I just wanted to say one last thing. Please do not underestimate the power that we have to influence in this context. We know broadcasters respond to audiences and the journalists who work for them. What you do and what we do matters. What we do and say matters. It matters more now than it ever has. Please join us in our efforts to make these reforms manifest at the CBC and beyond. With that, I would like to introduce Doug Hamilton-Evans, who is a communication strategist and the co-author of Quiet Alarm, to give us an overview of the report. Doug.
Okay, thank you, Tara. Thank you for all those words, and thank you all for being here today. So, as Tara mentioned, with this research, we wanted to assess a wide range of CBC climate coverage to show both the strengths and the weaknesses, to give a little help, a little nudge in helping it fulfill its commitment to tell the stories of our times. So this research was powered by 30 volunteers across the country who monitored the CBC's flagship news shows, such as The National and The World at 6 on CBC Radio, as well as some key current affairs programming during the 2 weeks between April 24th and May 5th, 2023. So you'll see we have the current on the island out of Victoria, the early edition here in Vancouver, Calgary Eye Opener, Edmonton AM, Metro Morning in Toronto, Ottawa Morning, Daybreak Montreal, and Information Morning out of mainland Nova Scotia. We also listened for climate items heard during World Report broadcasts within these morning shows. So each volunteer was asked to fill out a questionnaire on the climate stories they heard, which were designed to measure if the stories were following some of the best practices of climate journalism as offered by Covering Climate Now, which is a collective of news organizations committed to producing more informed, more urgent stories across beats about the climate. I should underline that this is an informal study. It does give us a strong indication, though, of what the CBC audience is experiencing, which we think warrants further action, further study. And I'd also like to take this moment to thank all of our research volunteers, all our advisors, many of whom are long-term CBC viewers and listeners, with extra special thanks to those who woke up very early in the morning to listen to these CBC morning shows. So what did our volunteers find? You'll see here that less than half of the broadcasts monitored had a single climate item, and our definition of which was broad to also include stories purely about extreme weather events, whether they made the connection to climate or not. Out of the 96 climate stories encountered, almost half were about extreme weather events, particularly wildfires in Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan, and flooding in Quebec and BC in the first week of May. And of those items about extreme weather events, 78% did not mention that climate change makes them more frequent and more severe. Only 9% of the climate stories mentioned the burning of fossil fuels as the primary cause of climate change. Less than a quarter clearly discussed solutions to climate change, with volunteers reporting they were unsure if they heard solutions or not 11% of the time. And only 6% of the items clearly communicated that there were things that you, the listener, the viewer, could do to address the climate crisis, with volunteers unsure 3% of the time. And when actions were offered, 73% were individual actions or consumer choices, while 27% were collective or political actions. So the way we read this, we see a clear need to put climate reporting front and center in regular and everyday programming, not isolated in special shows or content that you have to seek out. So, but this is our top level data. I'd like to quickly summarize 7 key observations that build upon this before getting into the recommendations this report makes and our panel discussion. So first, some well-deserved flowers and kudos. We did see strong climate journalism from the CBC before, during, and after our research period, and called attention to several stories in this report, and Tara mentioned some off the top. In particular, in this report, we single out the bi-weekly climate panel on the early edition out of CBC Vancouver, featuring Dr. Melissa Lem, president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and Janelle Lapointe from the Stalatin First Nation, who works at the David Suzuki Institute. We argue that this is a model that all CBC News and current affairs programs can learn from. But as a whole, this research suggests that this substantial climate reporting was not heard in the daily news programming that structures people's lives, which our volunteers found to often be sporadic, inconsistent, often absent, or short and cursory. I do want to point out that there was variance between programs. For example, On the Island out of Victoria consistently performed above average across all our key indicators. Meanwhile, The National and The World at 6 out of CBC News, their flagship programs on TV and radio, performed well below our key indicators. The Current with Matt Galloway, though, dedicated a high proportion of its total programming during this time to climate stories and offered segments of depth and length, which is by design of the show. It also communicated things the listener could do more than the average, but we did not hear a connection between extreme weather and climate change or climate change and fossil fuels. And in fact, climate stories during this period, we found are not regularly making that connection between the burning of fossil fuels, extreme weather, and the climate crisis. And making that connection between the causes and consequences of climate change is a best practice from Covering Climate Now. And they note that it doesn't have to distract from the story. A few choice words can do it. And this lack of connection between fossil fuels, extreme weather, and the climate crisis was most pointed out of CBC programming out of Alberta during this period. You may remember that during this time, the writ was dropped for the provincial election. Then 5 days later, a state of emergency was declared as thousands of Albertans evacuated from advancing wildfires. You might also remember that climate change was almost non-existent in the campaign or the election coverage. Our listeners to Edmonton AM during this time heard 15 climate items, which, to be fair, is the most of any program we monitored, with 9 being about extreme weather events and only 2 making the connection to climate change, which did meet the study's less than impressive average. I'd also like to point out that only 7% below average mentioned fossil fuels as the cause of climate change. Meanwhile, our volunteers only heard 3 items from Calgary Eye Opener during this time, 2 about wildfires, and none making the connection between fossil fuels and climate change. Solutions are out there, but Canadians are not hearing them. One of Covering Climate Now's best practices is to tell the whole story, including the solutions, meaning that to only focus on the negative can leave people feeling overwhelmed and numbed, and it's also not the whole story. There are many solutions at our fingertips, from renewable energy projects to political, cultural, and economic ones, all of which deserve interrogation so we can decide on what's most worth pursuing. But as we mentioned, our volunteers only heard solutions clearly 22% of the time. And when they did, they were often described as a means to adapt or react to the damages caused by fires and floods, although there was much about federal investment into renewable energy. And our volunteers also reported hearing solutions discussed without the problem attached, meaning renewable energy projects would be presented without noting that they are necessary to get off of fossil fuels and address climate change. Politicians set the story, but are among the most least trusted messengers about climate. So we asked our volunteers to identify the sources of information in the climate story to suggest who was defining or shaping the narrative. And as you would expect, politicians and government officials were the most quoted sources, but we cite research in this report that shows that they are among the least trusted messengers about climate, with physicians and scientists as among the most trusted, particularly when they're speaking about the health impacts of climate change. Yet here we see climate scientists and health professionals among the least cited sources in this period. We see members of the public frequently interviewed to discuss extreme weather events, but what this graph doesn't show is they're much less often spoken to for stories not about extreme weather events, sort of 8 out of 49 stories we found. And while one of Covering Climate Now's best practices is to treat activists like newsmakers, here we saw activists identified as sources for 7 out of the 96 stories, with comments from volunteers suggesting they were rarely, if ever, the primary definers of the story. Canadians are not hearing from a diversity of impacted communities. We asked our volunteers to identify the communities impacted in the climate stories they encountered as a rough proxy for whether this item was following Covering Climate Now's best practice of centering climate justice. This understands that marginalized groups generally suffer first and worst from climate impacts, and their voices are often omitted from news coverage. And that strong climate reporting should recognize that they are often also leading the climate fight, as seen from Indigenous land and water defenders and clean energy innovators across so-called Canada. And of course, the CBC does have a duty to inform Canadians about what's happening in Canada, so it's no surprise that people living in Canada was our most cited community here. But the climate crisis is a global issue, and volunteers rarely heard about how climate breakdown is disproportionately impacting people in the global south, which we argue is necessary to understand the consequences of our actions, that our fates are bound together, and that climate knows no borders. We also heard rarely about vulnerable populations, unhoused people, people with disabilities, seniors, etc., and children and young people who contribute the least to this crisis and will live through the worst of it. Racialized communities disproportionately affected by the climate crisis were never explicitly mentioned. Indigenous peoples and communities were frequently mentioned when discussing the impacts of wildfires, but for climate stories not about extreme weather, they were mentioned 4 out of 49 stories, maybe 8% of the time. And we see missed opportunities with such a high number of none of the above, as communicating the impact of the crisis can make it more tangible and urgent for us all. And our final observation here, this climate connection can be made stronger across beats. We asked volunteers to listen for items that should have or could have benefited from a discussion of the climate crisis following Covering Climate Now's best practice, Climate is a Story for Every Beat. Besides the misconnections in the Alberta election, our volunteers wanted to hear more about climate in relation to conflict in Ukraine and Sudan. They also wanted to hear business and political stories that were about fossil fuel infrastructure projects clearly discuss their climate impacts. They also wanted to hear about climate and agriculture, climate and foreign policy, and climate and urban planning. So based on all this, we offered a few recommendations in the report. One, make the connection between the causes of the climate crisis, its consequences, and the communities impacted to improve climate literacy in Canada. Two, develop and implement climate and environment-specific standards and languages through the JSP. Three, provide training on basic climate science, policy, and climate communications to all journalists so everyone is equipped to cover climate across every beat. Four, join Covering Climate Now. Five, provide more international coverage of global cooperation efforts to mitigate climate change and how the crisis disproportionately impacts the Global South and Indigenous and marginalized communities everywhere. Six, report annually about CBC's climate reporting so we can keep track of these things. And seven, finally, I think this is our big one. They're all big. This is a very big one. Develop a daily climate emergency report for local and national news and current affairs programs. This report would let Canadians know how this battle for our lives is unfolding at home and abroad on a regular basis. And ideally, we recommend that this would be produced by a newly created National Climate Emergency Unit that could feed daily content across the corporation, across regions, across programs. We felt so strongly about this recommendation that we actually recorded demos of what a daily climate emergency broadcast could sound like, featuring Seth Klein, who you'll be hearing from today, and Angelia Paterai from the Climate Emergency Unit, with professional hosting by science and climate journalist Zaya Tong. And we want to give a special thanks to SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement for producing these. So to wrap this up, thank you for your patience. I'd like to underline that these findings in this informal study are limited to a narrow window of time, a narrow window of CBC programming. We are often impressed by CBC climate coverage and the great hard work done by countless journalists there who are constantly responding to a never-ending news cycle, shifting situations, precarious work. Our recommendations are largely of a structural, systemic nature to invest in and claim the space necessary for this crucial reporting on the crisis of our lives. We believe in the CBC as a democratic institution. We know it faces constraints. And while often critical, this report is not the definitive story about the CBC's climate coverage. We see CBC doing good and improving work on the climate crisis, but in the face of an ongoing emergency that is getting worse daily, we all need to do more. And now, thank you.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation, Doug. Okay, so we're going to move into our dialogue now. Doug is going to join the panel as well. So if there's questions for him specifically, we'll be able to get to those in the panel. And so I'm just going to, I'll just introduce everybody at once. And as I introduce you, please come up and join us. So first, we'll introduce Seth Klein. So Seth is the team lead and director of strategy with the Climate Emergency Unit. Prior to that, he served for 22 years as the founding director of BC's Office for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Canada's foremost social justice think tank. He's also the author of a very inspiring book, if you haven't read it yet, called A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And he's a regular columnist with the National Observer and an adjunct professor with SFU's Urban Studies program. Kamyar Razavi is an environment and climate change reporter at Global News. Welcome, Cam. He's also a freshly minted PhD graduate from the SFU School of Communications. He just defended a couple of weeks ago, so congrats, Cam. CAM examines the role of solutions-oriented journalism in engaging audiences on climate. And Doug, who we've already met, is the co-author of the Quiet Alarm Report, along with myself. And on Zoom, we have Donya Ziaee joining us, who is a researcher at the Council of Canadians. She was previously a producer at the CBC Radio and is currently a host at the Breach, which is an independent media organization. She has a master's in journalism and another master's in political science, and Donya helped us out quite a bit with the report. She was quite instrumental in advising us on certain aspects of it. So she is joining us as well. So I'm going to join the panel with the mic. This one? Okay. So maybe we'll start with the audience. Are there any questions right now based on what we heard about the report? No burning questions as of now. On Zoom, do we have any questions? Not yet? Okay. So I'll jump in with one. Doug, maybe I'll start with you. What surprised you most about the report?
I think the silence or the lack, I don't know if that came up as much in the presentation, but less than half actually having climate items means our volunteers are, listened to a lot or watched a lot of CBC programming, waiting for climate items to come up and just not hearing them. I picked up a lot of volunteer shifts, either like double or just make sure that everyone was doing things. And so, listening to the Calgary Eye Opener and spending a lot of time and not hearing anything or waiting for it to come, or sitting through the National and kind of thinking, surely now we're going to make that climate connection, and then just hearing more about the coronation of King Charles. So it's just this sort of, where is it? Or watching the National online, I don't know if any of you have done that, it's brutal. You have to sit through like 4 really long ads. And I saw someone in the chat mentioning, what about a recommendation to get rid of ads? And I think our scope is much more in programming, but like, I would love to see a CBC without ads, or at least not fossil fuel or car ads. But yes, it was the silence. It could have been the 2 weeks we picked, but that was what stunned me when I was going back to revisit this for this presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we heard that from our volunteers too. We heard like once you start paying attention, you realize how the absence becomes very glaring. So yeah, that's a great observation. Stuart.
Yeah, do you mind if I ask?
Yes, please.
I want to thank the writers and the research volunteers for their work. It's a fantastic project. I think the final recommendation, Doug, that you shared with us is tremendously important about a daily a daily climate crisis report. Thank you. And I wonder if there are any international examples that folks are aware of that might give us beyond the example that was shared, of the kind of intervention that could be in our daily consciousness. Does anybody know if there are examples of this that we can turn to?
Sure, I'll jump in on that one. I can't think of exactly a daily show like that. However, there are so many amazing news services out there with a climate focus. Once you're part of this, once you've decided to follow climate, you can get on, whether it's Canada's National Observer, which I write for, which I think really does it every day in my inbox every day, the Energy Mix, Carbon Brief out of the UK. So it might be worth mentioning actually that as these guys were doing this amazing job on this study, the report links to the fact that in the same 2-week window, I was given another task, which was to track all the climate stories underway nationally and internationally that weren't being covered. So you can link from the main report to this basically listing every day an incredible array of climate stories that, if we did have a daily climate emergency report, could easily fill it with all kinds of content.
Thank you. So one way we wanted to kind of kick off the dialogue was to invite some reflections from our panel on the report. And so I'm going to open that up now. And I was thinking, Donya, maybe we could start with you.
Sure, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Well, thanks so much for including me in this conversation and for all the work that all of you have done on this really important report. As Tara mentioned, I spent about 4 years at the CBC working on several national radio shows. And I want to start by telling you some of the things I heard during my time there. Climate-related stories are too complicated to do. They're too boring. They're too predictable. They're too depressing. They make people feel bad about themselves. We've heard it all before. Activists and advocates are already always on what's the fresh new angle. So it's really telling for me that the resistance that comes from doing, solid coverage of the climate crisis isn't always necessarily because there is an explicit directive from above or a particular editorial line that newsrooms and programs are towing. I find that's often the most simplistic explanation, but in practice, it can be a lot more insidious. It's about how much the dominant ideologies and the narratives that are espoused by people who have power and wealth and influence have just seeped into the minds of journalists and editors and become ingrained. Now, sometimes there are obviously directives as well, and some of them can be are actually insufficient or even restrictive, and sometimes comical. So you may remember there was a move by The Guardian to avoid the use of the term climate change because it was, or global warming, for more accurate terms like the climate crisis, emergency, or breakdown. And when the CBC's Director of Journalistic Standards and Practices was asked if the CBC would follow suit, he said that they won't because those terms, crisis, emergency, breakdown, carry, and I quote, a whiff of advocacy. And so his line of reasoning was that we can't tell the truth about what's happening because it makes us seem partisan. And so when I think about the report that we're all discussing today, and I think about that finding, I think it was the second finding that climate news at the CBC tends to be sporadic and inconsistent and often absent. In my mind, a lot of that owes to the ideological biases that just permeate these newsrooms. And on top of that, we have a public broadcaster whose job in theory is supposed to be, quote, inform, enlighten, and entertain Canadians. I'm not even sure it's been very successful at entertaining Canadians lately, but on the informing and enlightening part, I think we can say without a doubt that the CBC is failing people in Canada, whether it's on climate or other issues. One thing that grabbed my attention about the report was just the example of the early months of the pandemic and how the CBC demonstrated that it can step up when it's needed. First of all, it called the pandemic a pandemic, as it was one. It pivoted its reporting to give frequent updates to the public. It was trying to explain what's happening in plain language, talk about the risks, solutions, encourage behaviors. And we heard a lot of scientists on the air. They were the voices of authority. Now, arguably, public health officials also got quite a bit of airtime and sometimes were approached not critically enough or questioned about the policies they were enacting. But the point is there was a clear decision to devote the resources and airtime it took to treat the pandemic with the urgency and gravity that it called for. And we've seen no vision or leadership of that kind from the CBC when it comes to the climate crisis. It took the broadcaster until just 2 years ago, the fall of 2021, to designate climate as a beat. That's embarrassingly late. And even then, it didn't actually devote a lot of additional resources in order to set this up or climate up as a content unit of its own that's fully functioning and well-resourced. It was just sort of an umbrella that encompassed some of the work that was happening. And if you compare that to what is the biggest employer at CBC as far as newsrooms go, that's the business unit. And so there's a very clear demonstration here of where the priorities lie. And for me, it's telling that some of the best investigative stories about the climate crisis at the moment, the ones that actually hold people in power to account and track and expose the influence of the fossil fuel industry and their reach, these stories are not coming from the public broadcaster, but from alternative media, the Narwhal, the Breach, to name a few. And we know a lot of what we owe to these journalists who have made it their mission to tell the stories that are being ignored or sidelined at places like the CBC. And I think they can be part of the inspiration that we can look to for what public service journalism can actually look like. Now, imagine if these extremely small but very mighty teams can do so much. Imagine what potential there is for a national broadcaster to do. I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you, Donya. Thank you for that, Donya. Maybe I'll invite Cam if you want to jump in.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us and for inviting me to this event. So I've been with Global News for quite a long time, 20 years, but I actually started my career at CBC, believe it or not, and then moved over to Global because opportunity presented itself there. But I've only been a climate reporter for the last 2 years at Global on what we call our investigative and enterprise unit. So this is a specialized unit within the online team that does, as the name suggests, longer term investigative and enterprise stories. I guess what I found the most surprising about the report is, how closely the findings paralleled my own research findings in my PhD, almost to a T. So that gave me a bit of comfort that that I did my research right. Yeah. And thanks. And the other thing was that, broadly speaking, and this is totally my own anecdotal feel, that the findings as they pertain to the CBC also broadly align with my own experience at Global as a climate reporter. And I think that's because, as Donya suggested, we in the mainstream news media kind of follow a similar playbook. We sort of adhere to the same cues and norms as other mainstream channels. Also, within Global, there's a lot of people who came from the CBC. And so I guess you could say that the worldview of the mainstream media in Canada, broadly speaking, is aligned. And this is why I think alternative outlets like the Narwhal or the Observer or the Tyee are such an important intervention, because they push us to consider frames and paradigms that maybe don't feel natural to us. And by that I mean that they violate our sense of quote unquote objectivity. So those are really important interventions. I would also say that I think the reason that climate faces such an uphill battle is not because newsroom editors necessarily don't want to cover climate, or even that they see it as too complicated or boring. I think that's kind of changing now, because it's impossible to ignore the effects of climate change. I mean, the wildfires in Ontario and Quebec this summer really, it was impossible to ignore. But I think the real reason is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of climate and how to cover it well, and we can talk about some ways to cover climate well. But also there's, as Donya suggested, a political economy that acts as a real barrier to generative climate coverage. And what I mean by that is that we here in Canada have a very powerful fossil fuel sector. In terms of jobs, the fossil fuel industry, it doesn't, as a proportion of the labor force, it's very small, but it wields enormous power, symbolic power, cultural power, economic power. And so I think in mainstream news media, there's still a feeling that challenging the power of the fossil fuel sector is somehow going against the norm, swimming against the current, and it feels as if it is not objective to challenge that power. It's kind of like we're not swimming in the right lane, if I could put it that way. And so I think we need more journalism that challenges the power of the fossil fuel industry, and that is not a activist statement. That is the truth, that this is an industry that's highly polluting. And look at the way we cover tobacco. Nobody is writing about tobacco being good for you. That's just a frame that's escaped our national consciousness. And we cover smoking as a serious health concern. And so coverage of the fossil fuel sector, in my view, has to also start looking at the problem in a more truthful context. And that doesn't necessarily mean bashing on the fossil fuel sector, but it means stepping outside of the dominant narrative and actually reporting on this industry in a critical and objective, i.e. truthful way. And I think the political economy of the news media is such in Canada that we in the mainstream news media aren't quite allowed to tell that story yet. And just I'll close by saying, you know, I've been working on Trans Mountain all year. I've been doing several stories on the Trans Mountain expansion, and these stories receive far more scrutiny than a lot of other stories that we publish. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's because we're going up against an industry that's extremely powerful, that's extremely litigious, and there's a fundamental disconnect and misunderstanding amongst newsroom editors about how to challenge this industry without being an activist. And that discomfort still prevails in the mainstream news media ecosystem, as Donya pointed to Paul Hamilton at CBC, who felt that climate crisis was somehow being biased, which is completely ridiculous and quite frankly shameful of the CBC to think that. So yeah, those are my thoughts. And I guess I'll just close by saying that I think the fact that Global hired me as a climate reporter on the investigative team, and that stories like these Trans Mountain pieces I'm putting out there are doing relatively well, suggests that A, there's an appetite within the mainstream news media to consider this framing, and B, that among the Canadian public, there's a real interest in stories that challenge this, this industry and make that connection between fossil fuels and climate. But as the report concluded, that connection is not being made at all, or hardly at all, in the mainstream news media coverage, and that desperately needs to change. So thank you.
Thank you, Cam. And Seth, your reflections.
Yeah, sure. So, hi, everyone. Thanks for being here and joining us online. And first of all, I just want to say on behalf of the Climate Emergency Unit, what a pleasure it was working with the Community Engaged Research Initiative at SFU, and in particular, congrats to Doug and Tara on this excellent report. And I also want to acknowledge that it's a pleasure to be here on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. So I also wanted to start from the basic premises Tara did. It's an emergency. We're in trouble. And I've been asked to offer a bit of historic context. As Tara alluded to, I have this weird fascination with World War II. And I want to just offer some thoughts and examples about the role of media then and now in mobilizing the public to confront an emergency. And I want to start with an American example, which I learned about from a speech that was given by the legendary PBS journalist, Bill Moyers. So it was a speech that he gave in 2019 at a conference that was jointly hosted by The Nation and the Columbia Journalism Review. It was a speech entitled, "What if we covered the climate emergency like we did World War II?" And Moyers said to this audience, mostly of journalists, many of us have recognized that our coverage of global warming has fallen short. And then he recalled how, as a child, he used to listen to the radio coverage of the war with his parents, delivered by the renowned journalist Edward R. Murrow and the team from CBS News. And Moyers recounts this amazing story of how, on the eve of World War II, CBS bosses at headquarters in New York had determined that there had been too much bad news. And they sent a message to all of the European correspondents that instead they were going to do this big special on kind of a kind of song and dance feature of what's hot in all the European capitals. And Murrow, who was the CBS man in London, as they called it at the time, he calls his bureau colleague in Berlin and he relays the instructions, and then he tells his colleague, and we're not going to do that. And instead, they defied those instructions and they were on the scene to cover the invasion of Poland by the Nazis. And for the next 2 years, their coverage of that CBS News team, of the Blitz in London and the rest of what was unfolding in Europe, is credited with helping to bring about a 20 percentage point shift in US public opinion before Pearl Harbor about whether or not the US should join. And so Moyers reflects on that, and he says, those reporters were on the right side at the right time, in the right way, reporting on the biggest story of all, the fight for life itself. And Murrow, it's interesting to note, we don't remember him as some, great biased advocate or propagandist, but as one of the great journalists of the 20th century. We have prestigious journalism awards named for the guy. Moyers implored that audience of mostly young journalists and journalists in training. He said, can we get this story right? Can we tell it whole? Can we connect the dots and inspire people with the possibility of change? What's journalism for? Really, in the war, what was journalism for? Except to awaken the world to the catastrophe looming ahead of us, which sort of feels pretty apt for the present. Now let me bring it back home. In a fortuitous bit of timing, CBC had just been created 3 years before the war. And it was then just a radio service, of course. And it offered daily coverage of the war with reporting from Europe led by senior foreign correspondent Matthew Holton. And in an era when radio and entertainment options were limited, pretty much everyone gathered around the radio every night to hear these nightly reports. Now, depending on people's age, if they hear the name of the Canadian-born actor Lorne Greene, I don't know if you're my parents' generation, you think of the old Western TV show Bonanza, where he played Pa Cartwright. And if you're a child of the 70s like me, you think of him as the original Commander Adama in the first Battlestar Galactica series. But before he went off to Hollywood, he was the CBC's first newsreader. And during the war, Canadians kind of affectionately referred to him as the voice of doom. He had this incredible, deep voice. And every night, he brought the latest to the Canadian public. The CBC played this pivotal role in mobilizing the Canadian public during the war, making the threat real so that Canadians understood what was unfolding to be a clear and present danger. But anyway, enough of the history. I want to dig in a little bit more on this, on the polling in the present and this question of climate literacy that Doug alluded to. What the polling tells us in Canada is that a majority of the public is very anxious about the climate crisis. They see it as an emergency. They want governments to be doing more. That's the good news. But the level of literacy on climate is kind of appalling. Only about half of the public correctly understands that the main source of global warming is the combusting of fossil fuels. And that's how and why you can have a public that seemingly holds these dissonant views that on the one hand, they tell you they prioritize concern about the climate, and on the other hand, they may be prepared to accept the doubling down of the extraction of fossil fuels or new fossil fuel infrastructure. And they don't have clarity about the solutions, as Doug alluded to, or that the solutions exist, and that needs to be urgently remedied. I think one of the challenges when it comes to dealing with this whole issue is that for much of the public, there's a lack of a clear vision of what the future is going to look like and needs to look like. It's difficult to imagine what our lives and wider society, the picture is very fuzzy for people. And given this, a core task of all of us, but also the media, is to bring this new picture into focus and answer for the general public some very basic questions. What will my home and community look like in this new world? How am I going to make a decent living? How am I going to get around? Where's my food going to come from? Where's our energy and electricity going to come from? How will I play? Am I still going to be able to enjoy my leisure time? How are we going to pay for all of this? Are there sacrifices that we're going to have to make? Now, the good news is answers exist for all of these questions. And the picture that emerges is actually of a pretty good life. but we desperately need the media to bring that picture into focus. You know, when I make these historic references, people often say to me, you know, are you suggesting that the CBC should be some propagandistic outlet like it was in the war? So let me be clear. No, I'm not. We want our news media to be factual and science-based, but in the face of a humanitarian emergency and with the fate of civilization in the balance, we also expect our public broadcaster to pick a goddamn side. And if the CBC hadn't done that in the war, Canadians would have been rightly appalled. Public does not, in sufficient numbers, if the public does not in sufficient numbers, have basic climate literacy, and they don't, then our media have not done some basic work, and we need to press them to do their jobs. The CBC's crisis has been weak, as we've talked about. It has improved over the next little while, particularly just in the course of the summer. I think we saw an improvement in the CBC's reporting of extreme weather events, and they did a better job of connecting those events, even since the 2-week window of the study, I would say, a better job of connecting extreme weather to climate, but continue to do a terrible job of connecting climate to fossil fuels and connecting it to solutions. And to build on Doug's key recommendation and the one that Tara highlighted as well, you know, the CBC is now producing some great climate programming. Like, you know, on TV, there's The Nature of Things. On radio, there's What on Earth. On podcasts like Planet Earth. But that's where already interested in climate curious people have to proactively go and find it. We desperately need a daily climate emergency report that is embedded in the flagship shows, as Doug talked about. And if our morning radio shows can all have hourly business and sports reports, then surely to God, they can have a morning climate emergency report telling us how this battle for our lives is unfolding at home and abroad, telling us how we all have a part to play, not in a trite way, but in real transformative ways, and giving us this balance of both the bad news and the hopeful news, and providing us with some sense of agency. But just as Lauren Green and Matthew Holton did, you know, every night, the key national shows, The World at 6, the National, need to do that again, to bring us on board. And let us hear about you know, what other countries are doing in this battle with us, so that we have a sense that we're not in this alone. We're doing this with millions of other good people of goodwill. And in frequency and in tone, how we do this carries huge weight. And I think it's the duty of our public broadcaster to be the public broadcaster that it needs to be in an emergency.
Thank you, Seth. I have a couple more questions, but maybe I'll open it up if any questions bubbled up while folks were talking in the back.
Thanks. I'm wondering, I've been fairly steeped in independent media, but have lots of connection to CBC, as all of us do. I am wondering if there are a code of principles that are printed for CBC, and I suspect that there are, to govern some ways of discerning between fact and opinion. I mean, is there some way that some of those core foundations of journalism can be turned to work for us at this moment if they are treating fact like opinion and presuming that the presentation of fact is somehow partisan?
Donya, I'm wondering if, with your time at the CBC, if that came up at all.
Yes, there is. What we were talking about, the journalistic standards and practices that every journalist working at the CBC has to adhere to, and there are specific stipulations in there about being factual, about being accurate, about telling the truth, etc. I think it's a question of how these rules get interpreted, and then that's where the biases start coming in and influencing how they get how they get interpreted. I agree with you that we can use them to our favor, which is to say, hey, if you want to be factual, tell the truth about the climate crisis. But I think, yeah, the way that the challenge we face is how that is interpreted. If I can add an anecdote about this journalistic standards and what we were saying about the director of the standards and practices, Paul Hamilton, who famously said, using these terms carries a whiff of advocacy. At the time, I was working on a national radio show, and I actually made a pitch to interview him on air about those statements. And he refused. He didn't want to do it, but he spoke to me on the phone. And he said, listen, like, if we use these terms, we are now choosing to refer to these events using the terms of particular political parties in Canada, in this case, the NDP, and to some extent, the Liberals. And that makes us partisan. And we can't appear to, be partisan and oriented towards one particular party, which really raises the question, if if a particular party, let's say the Conservative, starts to fabricate some other lies about anything, like does the CBC not have a responsibility to actually parse truth from lies, even if there are particular parties that might benefit from that? I mean, that's what I mean when I say the standards are there, but the application is where we have a problem.
It might be worth saying too, this is why one of the core recommendations of the report is that the CBC should join Covering Climate Now, which is this international association of media outlets that is doing a good job, because they have produced the kind of checklist that I think you're asking about, of what does it look like to do this well, and hopefully to have those benchmarks being incorporated into the journalistic standards and practices at the CBC.
Yeah, if I could just respond also to your question. There is in newsrooms today a disconnect between the younger generation of incoming journalists and the old school, the old guard, including with respect to this question of objectivity. I would say the lasting view in newsrooms still to this day is that objectivity rests on telling both sides of the story, that kind of archaic, outdated view. But it's changing, thanks in large measure, I should say, to an influx of BIPOC journalists who are coming into newsrooms and really pushing us to think beyond that binary. And so I think it's also starting to be reflected in the journalistic P&Ps, maybe not as explicitly, but implicitly, that objectivity doesn't rest upon balance as bias, this binary frame, certainly with respect to climate. I mean, I distinctly remember maybe 11 years ago, producing a climate story and being told, I need to go speak to a climate denier. I distinctly remember that. Thankfully, that doesn't happen as much anymore, at least in mainstream respectable, maybe at Fox News it still does, but I think the journalistic P&Ps are starting to take stock that objectivity is not a question of telling both sides, but it's about getting as multiple perspectives as you can in order to paint as complete a picture as you can. The whole story is what the Solutions Journalism Network calls it. And so we don't see that written specifically into the journalistic P&Ps, but I think that view is starting to infuse newsrooms writ large, and that's a good thing. So,
Doug, did you want to jump in on that one?
No, I think that
I think one thing that came up in the report that I think this is part of what Covering Climate Now recommends is, and Doug mentioned it in his report, it's often like two words before a description of something. So fossil fuel induced climate change, for example, which the CBC does do in some places and not in others, which speaks to the inconsistency part. But some of these changes, I mean, are quite low-hanging fruit. It doesn't require an extra $1 million. It just requires a change in some of this language, and that built up over time can have quite an impact. I'm just going to check in on Zoom. Are there any questions? Okay.
So we have a question from Sibo. She writes, I have a question for the panelists. Given that young people are turning to social media, especially TikTok, for news, how can conventional radio programs like The Current remain engaging with the new generation of audiences?
Good question. Who wants to take that one on?
It's a
What
really
if I
good
told you
question,
they
and it's a
can't?
hard question. I mean, again, so the good news on the polling is that most of the public rejects climate denial and is there. But it is true, there's a generational thing. I mean, this is just anecdotal, but just the other weekend, I was realizing how much my 19-year-old daughter gets her news from TikTok. And even having this conversation with her about, you know, who are the people you're watching? And do you know if they're paid? Do you know what systems are in place for them to make sure that they're not sharing inaccurate or misinformation? And it's a worry that a whole generation is coming up getting news from people and outlets that have none of those systems in place. And I don't know quite what the solution is.
Well, it seems to be one of the challenges of journalism right now is you're not a TV journalist, you're not a radio journalist, you're not a web journalist. You often have responsibilities for all of those things, and CBC does have responsibility to meet people almost wherever they are on the broadcast waves. I think it's complicated when these social media networks spring up all over the place and they constantly have to react, but I think they do need to be where Canadians are. And modifying their content to get there. I think it's a complication and a challenge. I would love to hear from the working journalists that have experienced this to maybe push back on that. But yeah, I think it's one of the challenges of the CBC that the digital environment is constantly changing, yet they have this mandate to inform, enlighten, and entertain as best they can.
Yeah, I can try to take this on as well. Thank you, Sibo, for the question. Sibo and I were colleagues at SFU, so I know him well. It's such a simple yet difficult question. I think that the quick response, which might be a little controversial, is that, you know, I think what newsrooms do is new platform comes around, TikTok is now the new platform, thus we must put our journalists up on TikTok to produce TikTok videos from their apartments or whatever, wherever they are working remotely from. That would be sort of the knee-jerk reaction, and I'm not saying that's a bad idea. Who knows what the next platform will be? But I think broadly speaking, because climate is such a all-encompassing topic, we as journalists need to do a better job telling the climate story. And you often hear the Solutions Journalism Network say, well, tell stories about solutions, obviously, and meet people where they're at. Tell stories that are local, that affect you and your family where you're at, which is something the Narwhal does really well. I would also say that I think when it comes to solutions, one of the things that's not often talked about in solutions journalism is the role of conflict. Now, I know in your report you talk about conflict in terms of covering Sudan and Ukraine, but I'm talking about conflict as kind of a key ingredient of solutions journalism. This isn't really discussed amongst the folks at SJN, the Solutions Journalism Network, but conflict can actually be a very, very mobilizing thing. So, for example, stories of communities, be they in Metro Vancouver or elsewhere in BC, First Nations communities that are taking matters into their own hands, adopting solutions, and standing up to these forces that would do their communities harm. Fossil fuel pipeline being drilled through their lakes and rivers, or whatever as the case may be. That kind of conflict reporting as a quote unquote solution is extremely mobilizing and generative. I mean, you think back to the civil rights movement in the 60s. The people were rising up to face, massive conflict. Same with the fight in the 80s for access to life-saving AIDS medications. I mean, those stories of conflict are very, very mobilizing, and they get young people worked up. And so we saw a little bit of this in 2019 with Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future climate strikes. But there's dozens of stories out there about ordinary communities doing things big and small that are responding to this existential threat we face. And I think that is a really good way of getting young people engaged if we can only find those stories and go tell those stories. And one of the things I thought was really good in your report is that section where you talk about agency and who feels like they have agency. And giving young people, Indigenous people, covering their stories in a way that showcases their agency, I think is one of the most important ways of doing solutions journalism. And guess what? It's predicated on conflict. So it's kind of a weird way to think about solutions journalism, because solutions are like, oh yeah, great, But I think it's a really important way of thinking about solutions in a very under-discussed frame. And yeah, so that's my point about this.
I love that. Thank you. I would just add relationship building would be like one aspect that could be utilized here. Like, who are the content creators that are producing this information, and build a relationship with them. That doesn't mean hire them tomorrow, but where are they getting their sources from? How can CBC in this case be a source for a TikToker, a reliable, publicly funded source that a TikToker can then use? So I think, and that means like reaching out and respecting what they do, and respecting that they have an audience and that they have something to say, and supporting that, I think is another way to get the youngins involved.
Can I just
Donya,
add
did
real
you want
quick?
to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to add also that we shouldn't underestimate young people and their desire for good news, like critical coverage. Like, it's true, they may not necessarily be listening to The Current during their morning commute, but they might listen to the podcast version later, while they ride the bus to school, or they might hear, like, they might follow climate news on Instagram or wherever. Like, just because they're not doing it the way we used to doesn't mean that there isn't an appetite and a real like intellectual capacity also for grappling with difficult subject matter, and a real desire too. This Generation Z is one of the most politically active generations of the last few decades, and I just don't think we should, yes, it's true, we need to adapt and meet them where they're at, but I do believe that there's a real desire and appetite for good critical coverage among them.
Great. So we've got about a little less than 15 minutes left. So maybe we'll take another question from the room. I see your hand up there.
Hi. Thank you very much. I have been listening, but I just got here. So I did hear the panel, and I was particularly struck, Cam, by your comment that your Trans Mountain stories get extra scrutiny. And this is something that I've considered also, because my own submissions seem to get that. It's hard to know. Is it possible that we will ever get the story told of how this works in the newsroom, how the corporate power, it's a cultural phenomenon that several of the speakers have talked about, of the control that the oil and gas industry seems to have over our cultural interpretation of reality? Is that story going to be told, and can a reporter survive telling it about their own newsroom?
Delighted to see you here, Tim. Tim is one of my great sources on Trans Mountain. The short answer, Tim, is no. Not in the mainstream media, at least, sadly. I think the way that story is going to be told is as the Overton window shifts and we become, quote unquote, allowed to tell those stories, then by osmosis, that story will emerge. I think where that story could emerge is in the alternative press, if I can put it that way. A show like Democracy Now!, for example, frequently takes aim at mainstream news media frames, including around climate, although even Democracy Now! Can do a better job covering climate. Sometimes I also see them falling to mainstream news media tropes with respect to fossil fuel industry. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it's something well, I know it's not something nefarious that a Trans Mountain or oil industry story gets more scrutiny. It's not like there's some, overlord who's overlooking those stories because they have some kind of nefarious intention. I just think that's the ecosystem. We're challenging a very powerful fossil fuel industry, and going up against this massive political economy that says we need this industry for Canada, it's good for Canada. And I think coming back to what Seth said earlier, the imperative is to reduce that gap between people's concern for the environment, which is high, and their knowledge of the role of burning fossil fuels in accelerating the climate crisis, which is really low. If we can reduce that gap, then I think we in the news media will be allowed to tell those stories more frequently and get just as much scrutiny as any other story. And hopefully that will also result in people like the head of CBC's broadcast standards, Paul Hamilton, not believing that calling it a climate crisis is somehow advocacy, which is completely ridiculous. So
Maybe I'll just add too. So in defense of CBC, I would, my impression anecdotally is that the CBC is actually quite good at putting a firewall between their newsroom and their ad departments, for example, and not letting fear of lost advertising or something like that influence their coverage. I think the influence operates more subtly. So, for example, to your point about how litigious they can be, right? Everything gets lawyered up the wazoo. So if you're an industry ready to litigate on the drop of a hat, you create a culture of kind of anxiety, like, okay, are we going to be pressed on this? And you second guess yourself all the time. Some of that's good. I guess journalists should second guess themselves and check. And I think politically too, because we're operating in a context in which, the leader of the Conservative Party is going around the country leading chants of defund the CBC, it creates within management at the CBC this kind of hyper anxiousness, a bit of paranoia about the perception that you might have a liberal bias, and sometimes overcompensating. So I think, but this all operates really subtly.
Just one more quick point on this, and I credit my acquaintance and colleague Chris Hatch for this point at the National Observer, and just a plug for Chris, his newsletter is fantastic. But I think one of the things we don't talk about enough is class, the issue of class, because we in the news media tend to cater to an upwardly mobile middle class, suburban middle class audience for reasons that are obvious. I mean, that's where the 25 to 54 advertising demographic is. And so there's an entire worldview there that subscribes to upwardly mobile lifestyles, consumer spending, et cetera, that is so dependent on energy and fossil fuel subconsciously. And also we get money from advertisers, from fossil fuel advertisers, Pathways Alliance, for example. And so there's all these subconscious things that work. And I think if journalists thought about class more often, then maybe we could step outside of our quote unquote conventional worldviews and think upon them more critically.
Thank you.
If I could just follow on. Can you give me the microphone, otherwise our audience can't hear. Sorry about that. It's not surprising that the ecosystem is as you describe.
No.
And I have a hot tip. Next week, December 5th, the National Assessment Process Synthesis Report will come out. I know about this because I'm on the Health of Canadians in a Changing Climate. They have 10 main conclusions. And despite what our health report says, those 10 conclusions do not mention anything about emissions, that we could change the trajectory by reducing emissions. So this is the national assessment coming out next week.
I think we'll turn to Zoom for one more, and then I see your hand there, which we'll get to.
So this question is from Donya, from Jonathan. Donya, what do you suggest we do to force the CBC to address climate more like The Guardian, which I agree does a much better job?
Good question. There are a few.
Donya, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? There were a few other questions I noticed in the Q&A on Zoom with people saying, you know, what are actionable things that can be done to push for change? And I really want to echo what Kamyar said about the importance of that Overton window shifting and how it translates to change in these newsrooms. I think institutions like the CBC really do respond to public pressure, to shaming, and also to the strength of social movements on the ground. And so when these movements are strong, the journalists and editors inside also feel emboldened to reflect that popular sentiment and also to push their superiors, to push their newsrooms to do better. And we've seen this before. I mean, I was there at the CBC in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of the police, and the subsequent upsurge that there was in activism against police brutality and racist policing and in favor of protecting Black lives. And there was a lot of discussion, not just related to CBC, but just in general, about how claims around objectivity and neutrality meant that news outlets weren't covering and telling the truth about these injustices. They were uncritically, just parroting what the police had said. They weren't covering protests. They weren't giving enough airtime to activists on the ground. And at the CBC, this became a really, really hot button issue where journalists on the inside were saying enough is enough. Like, I feel stifled. I'm being told that I can't pitch these stories. My pitches are being turned down. I can't attend protests, I am told. They are monitoring my social media presence. And all of this talk about objectivity is really getting in the way of giving people the full picture, as we are here to do. And so there were many internal conversations. There were open letters, there were meetings, there were working groups. There were exposés that were written by people who formerly worked there and had left. And I do believe that all of it really made a tangible difference. Like, of course, some of it was cosmetic, as is to be expected at places like that. But I do think it made a lasting impact about how we understand objectivity. And it just made it that much harder for anybody to, use that as an excuse for poor journalism. And so, what can we do? Well, I think what happens inside these newsrooms answers and reflects what's happening outside on the ground. And so we can strengthen our social movements. We can, as Tara said at the beginning of this event, we can push for more. And in doing that, we are not only putting pressure on the institution, but we're emboldening people on the inside to also demand more.
Can I just add a request to those watching and here, building on Donya's point? So we have heard from our sources inside the CBC that the report is being widely circulated, that the report that Tara and Doug have done within the CBC, and it's coming up in meetings and being referenced inside. But to the extent that all of you can bring the report to CBC journalists and non-CBC journalists, bring it to the producers of your morning and afternoon radio shows. The fact that CBC Vancouver morning show has a climate panel, if your city's CBC doesn't have one, ask for a weekly climate panel. But the more they hear from their own base and listeners and viewers that this is what you're expecting, the better.
Okay, so we've got just 2 minutes left. I want to get to this final question here, and I'll just ask the panelists to keep our responses brief so we end on time.
Sure, I'll try to be right to the point as the son of someone who gave a talk on carbon pollution in 1980 and the father of someone who has a daughter who has climate misery, I guess I could say, in overlooking her life. A little while ago, I heard Andrew Weaver say that population growth was the elephant in the room that no one talks about emission growth and so on. And I think the reason for that is we're not long-term thinkers. My father was. He was thinking a generation ahead. And I think we have to tell young people about to give them the knowledge of what's going on in the future and how we can present that and make that real. For example, building on the lowlands where we're going to have sea level rise and it's going to be flooded. Are we talking to the mayors and so on of those areas? What are you doing to prepare for what's coming in 50 years? Because it's no longer just a radical idea. So that's a part of this climate coverage, I guess, is to make people think long-term, I guess.
I think the future idea of looking forward and how we use our resources is important. I think this idea of population growth being the most threatening thing, I think has largely been discredited, and I think we much need to look more at who has the most, who is consuming the resources, and how. But the central idea of, are we consuming more than our planet can possibly afford? Absolutely, that should be something central to emissions and climate degradation discussion.
I'll steer clear of the Malthusian debate for now, but only to say quickly that this is the whole genesis of solutions reporting. If we could just take the word solutions out of it, it lowers the temperature, but the idea is to show how people are leading the way and tell those stories of who is already starting to paint that new future, as you say, because we as humans need help to do this. We discount the future. This is just in our DNA. And so our role as storytellers should be to help draw that new collective imagination, as Seth alluded to earlier. And I think it's a failure of journalism to not do that. And this is why I do agree with telling the whole story, that, you know, this lingo that SJN uses, Solutions Journalism Network. We have to do a better job of telling that. And I think that solutions journalism is starting to get a little bit more purchase in mainstream news media as we move beyond this tired narrative of objectivity, etc.
Okay, so on that note, I think we're gonna wrap up. I would like to thank our amazing panel for such an engaging discussion. Wow. And I would also like to thank our CERi team, Joanna and Jesse and Stephen and Gray in particular. Thank you so much for helping pull this event off. And of course, our tech team, of which none of this could have happened, especially the hybrid side. Thank you so much. And just going forward, please subscribe to CERi's newsletter, also the Climate Emergency Unit newsletter. That's where you'll find ways to continue to engage with us on this issue. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you all being here in person. Thank you. And over Zoom. And to our Zoom participants as well. Thank you.